because they say the truth will set you free, and yet sometimes you learn the truth, and yet you're like, you know what? I'll still stay caged in, even though I know I could leave. Like, this is what's familiar to me, and it becomes your comfort zone. Even though it's a bad place to be, it's what's familiar and it's what's comfortable. Hello, and thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I am talking about It by Stephen King, published in 1986. And I'm comparing it with both of the newer movies. So they are both directed by Andy Muschietti. So we have It from 2017 and then It Chapter 2 from 2019. And there, of course, is also the 1990 miniseries. And for fans of that miniseries, do not worry. I will be talking about that as well in a follow-up video. I plan to release that on Friday, so stay tuned for that. And as a little sneak peek into that video, I loved the miniseries, so I haven't yet filmed that video, but I'm so excited to talk about it because I really enjoyed it. And I also wanted to mention that there is a new show coming out sometime later this year. I don't think they have a set release date for it yet, as far as I know. But Bill Skarsgård reprises his role as Pennywise, and it is called Welcome to Derry, and it tells about the events that happened in Derry prior to the kids meeting it when they were 11 years old. And in the book, we hear so many stories through the decades in Derry of all of the horrible things that have happened in this town. And so I haven't watched the trailer, but I assume that's what this TV show will be talking about. Is it like an adaptation of all of these Derry interlude sections? So these sections were so good and had so many disturbing, creepy, scary stories. And so I will definitely be watching the show once it comes out. And if I like it enough to finish it, I will make a video sharing my thoughts. But yeah, I'm excited to see what they do with it. And this book is over 1,100 pages long. So there is so much here that never made it into the movies. So there is more than enough material for this TV show. So yeah, I'm excited to check it out. But as far as these two movies go, so the first film focuses only on the kids, which takes place in the 1980s in the movie. And then the second movie focuses on the adults primarily in present day with a few flashbacks back to when they were kids. Whereas the book is constantly going back and forth between these two timelines. And in the book, present day is in the late 1980s, and the past, when they were 11 years old, takes place in the late 1950s. And by the way, real quick, I got these earrings on Etsy. I will link to them. They are so cute. There were so many different Pennywise, Stephen King related earrings, and yet these ones are just so perfect. I love them. And then in the book in particular, orange pom-poms are always around when Pennywise is involved. And so that is why I have these fluffy orange things on my wrist. And then, of course, if you've read the book, you know why I have a spider web t-shirt or, a spider web top, but I will be getting into that later on in the video. But yeah, I'm really excited for today's video, and we have a lot to get into, so let's just get right to it. And from here on out, I will have spoilers going forward. So this is about 7 friends in Derry, Maine, who battle an entity they refer to as It. And it takes a lot of forms, but taking the shape of a clown called Pennywise is its go-to. And they fight it when they are 11 years old. However, it did not die, and it returns after a 27-year break. And that is the cycle it has been doing for millions of years now, where it comes alive, or where it wakes up for about a year, and there's just like a lot of violence and death, and that's when it feeds. And then it sleeps for about 27-ish years before waking up again and doing it all over. And so because they did not actually kill it when they were 11, when they are in their late 30s, it returns, and so they all return to the town of Derry to battle it one more time. And I'm going to start by talking about the 7 kids individually, and then also talk about Derry, Maine, the town, because that is a huge part of this story, and then also it itself, and then the different themes going on. And so this is a long video, as you can see, and I will have it broken up into the timestamps down below, so you can jump around as you see fit. But, the video will be enjoyed best if you watch it all the way through. But both book and movie begin with the death of Georgie, who is Bill's younger brother. In the book, a guy saw Georgie when he was being attacked, and so he was able to get his body, but Georgie still died. Whereas in the movie, he is dragged into the sewer, and so Bill doesn't want to accept that he is dead and wants to believe that he is just missing and that there is still hope. And in both, Bill and his friends hang out in a place called the Barrens, and in the movie, the reason they go there is because Bill thinks Georgie may have been swept through the sewers and come out into the opening that's in the Barrens. Whereas in the book, this is just where they like to hang out. And in both, Bill has a lot of guilt about Georgie's death because he is the one that made him the paper boat, and the fact that he didn't go with him that day to go sail the paper boat. And in the movie, we learned that Bill lied about being sick and really just hadn't wanted to hang out with Georgie. But in the book, he truly had been sick. He wasn't lying about it. I was kind of confused why the movie felt the need to add in this little detail. But yeah, so in both, he feels a lot of guilt, and his friends try to convince him, like, hey, like, it's not your fault. You don't need to blame yourself. And they're trying to be supportive and help him. And it kind of helps, but ultimately he still harbors a lot of regret and blame. And the movie kind of shows how his home life has not been great since the death of Georgie, but in the book we see this, it's portrayed so vividly, and there are a few sections I want to read that talk about this. So the first one reads, "In those days, his mom and dad had also been bookends on the couch, but he and Georgie had been the books. Bill had tried to be a book between them while they were watching TV since George's death, but it was cold work. They sent the cold out from both directions, and Bill's defroster was simply not big enough to cope with it. He had to leave because that kind of cold always froze his cheeks and made his eyes water." And then one of the most gut-wrenching scenes in the book that has stuck with me is when Bill, he is reflecting back to when Georgie was alive and how he and his family would hang out in the living room, and, Bill or one of the parents would crack a joke and they would all laugh, and Georgie would laugh even though he was too young to understand it, and everyone knew he didn't get it, and yet he laughed anyway. And so it's just this fond childhood memory of hanging out in the living room, telling jokes. And so Bill, he comes home one day after Georgie's death, and his parents are just blankly staring at the TV. And he's like, "Hey, do you guys want to hear a joke?" And he tries to tell them this joke. However, he stutters. He stuttered before Georgie's death, but once Georgie dies, his stutter is just so constant. And so he is trying to tell his parents this joke, but his stutter is making it take so long just to get the joke out. And once he says it, his parents, they either don't even hear or they just don't even care. And it was just such a gut-wrenching scene where this poor boy who is grieving the loss of his brother and grieving the loss of what his family once was, and he is trying to reconnect to his parents by doing something that they had fond memories of in the past. And yet, this stutter is, taking over, and then the parents don't even care. And it was like, it makes me feel emotional just thinking about it, because it was just such a heartbreaking scene. And the way King wrote this scene, again, it was just so vivid and so painful and so sad. And again, it was one of those moments where I just wanted to hug 11-year-old Bill and comfort him, because his parents the parents had the death of a son, right? So of course they're grieving. But yeah, I just really felt for Bill in this moment. And then there is another section I want to read. Bill sat there sweating but cold, so cold. It was cold because he wasn't really the only book between those two ends. Georgie was still there. Only now it was a Georgie he couldn't see. A Georgie who never demanded the popcorn or hollered that Bill was pinching. This new version of George never cut up Dickens. It was a one-armed Georgie who was palely, thoughtfully silent in the Motorola's shadowy white and blue glow, and perhaps it was not from his parents but from George that the big chill was really coming. Perhaps it was George who was the real killer from the white wastes. Finally, Bill had fled from that cold, invisible brother and into his room, where he lay face down on his bed and cried into his pillow. But as far as the friend group goes, so Bill is the leader of this group, and they call themselves the Losers, since they all get beat up by a bully named Henry Bowers and his cronies. And because Pennywise killed Georgie, he is far more personally invested, especially in the movie, in confronting Pennywise. But I would say in the book, over the course of the story, they all become just as invested, I would say, because Pennywise has been targeting each of them in its own way. And so while they didn't suffer a personal death like Bill, and so he does have that going on, and yet, yeah, ultimately, in the book in particular, they all were just as committed, whereas in the movie, I think it definitely is really on Bill. And when they face it as kids, Bill has to stand up to his guilt over Georgie, because it takes the shape of Georgie and it tries to get Bill to be overcome by the blame and to allow it to overpower him. But in both, he stands up to this false Georgie. And eventually, after this confrontation, they think they have killed it. However, of course, we know they didn't, because it comes back 27 years later. But when it is there as the ghost of Georgie, there is this reoccurring phrase that Bill has been trying to say to help with his stutter, and it's it thrusts its fist against the post and still insists it sees the ghost. And so he's saying this to it as Georgie. And then I like it because it's like, and still insists he sees the ghost. And he's like, but you are no ghost. You're not the ghost of Georgie. You're just it. And then he also uses the term false face, which is another phrase we got in The Shining. So we hear that here as well. But yeah, when they face it again as adults, Bill once more needs to confront the guilt he has still been harboring over Georgie and finally release that and, truly process it when he faces it as an adult. And one of the ways the movie shows this that is not in the book is when adult Bill sees a boy in town, and this boy is played by the same actor who played Georgie. And he tells Bill that he'll hear voices in the sewers and stuff. And then Bill gets super intense and tells him, like, tell your parents you gotta leave town, do whatever it takes, you gotta get out of here. And then later, he knows that the boy went to the fair, and like Pennywise does something to show that he's going to kill this boy, basically. And so Bill goes to the fair and tries to save this boy, only to have him killed in front of him. And so once again, it's like losing Georgie all over again, and he still couldn't have done anything to stop it. But then, once he goes down to the sewers is when he fully confronts the truth of the situation and is able to forgive himself. In the book, this was a sweet scene because he breaks down crying in the sewers, being like, I'm sorry, Georgie, I'm sorry. And in the dark, all of his friends gather around to comfort him as he is once again processing all of this. And then the initial friend group had consisted of Bill, Stan, Eddie, and Richie. And so to move now on to Eddie, he has his own problems because he is raised by a mom who basically has Munchausen by proxy, or maybe she doesn't full on have that yet. I don't know if it would be considered that at this point, but it's in the territory because she is so worried that Eddie will get sick or hurt that she makes him think he truly does have different sicknesses, specifically asthma, but yeah, she's always paranoid about him getting hurt in some way and is always taking him to the emergency room and like really messing with his head, thinking that he has all of these issues when really he doesn't. And at one point, Eddie is alone and Henry Bowers in the book, he shows up and he breaks Eddie's arm. And so she takes Eddie to the hospital and his friends show up to see him, but his mom does not like his friend group. And so she tells them off and they leave. However, Eddie then, he's very timid around his mom, but in this moment, he stands up to her about one, the fact that she's been lying about his asthma, and two, being like, if my friends come in again, like, don't you dare stop them. And so it was great seeing Eddie confront his mom, but I also liked how King does a good job with characters who we don't like Eddie's mom, who does messed up stuff to Eddie, messing with his head. And yet he does a good job at humanizing them because in this moment in the hospital room, we see into her thoughts and just why she is this way with Eddie. And so it doesn't condone what she does, but we can at least understand her and maybe feel some pity for her, despite still not agreeing with what she is doing. But yeah, after this, when his friends come in again, she doesn't try to stop them and they are able to see Eddie. Whereas in the movie, he does break his arm, but here it is when they visit the house on Neibolt Street. And when he returns home, his mom yells at his friends, and this leads to a breakup between the friend group. And then later on, after some time has passed, Bill calls Eddie and tells him that they need to face it again. And this is when Eddie stands up to his mom, similar to the way he had in the book in the hospital scene. And this actor was just so cute. And I love this part when he is confronting her about the medicine because the lady at the pharmacy had told him that it was a placebo, but he gets the word wrong and he calls it a gazebo. And he was just so cute. I really liked Eddie in the book, but honestly, both the 90s miniseries and this movie, both Eddies, their portrayals were just so good and it made me love the character all the more. But then as an adult, Eddie ends up marrying someone much like his mother in personality and looks. By the way, the same actress plays both characters, which I thought was a great touch. But he is still a hypochondriac who uses an inhaler even though he knows he doesn't have asthma. And when he tells the others about the day he found out the medicine was fake, he says how it should have been a turning point and it should have caused him to drop the fake meds and choose a different life, and yet he didn't. And I like this for multiple reasons because one, it feeds into the theme of if you believe something will work, it will, which comes up later as far as it goes. But then also it seems just kind of true to life in some ways, because they say the truth will set you free. And yet sometimes you learn the truth and yet you're like, you know what? I'll still stay caged in, even though I know I could leave. Like, this is what's familiar to me, and it becomes your comfort zone. Even though it's a bad place to be, it's what's familiar and it's what's comfortable. And so you do end up staying, even though you know the truth of the situation. And as we see with other characters, their pasts haunt them and lead them to make poor adult choices. And Eddie, as an adult at this point, he still hasn't fully processed his trauma. And so it makes sense that he is still using these placebos as a crutch and still seeking out things that are harmful to him, and yet they are familiar. And so there's a certain comfort in that. And then to move on to Richie, so he is the comedian of the group, and not gonna lie, there were times in the book when I just skimmed over his dialogue because, for one, this was my second time reading the book. I read it just last summer, less than a year ago, and so I had already read it. But yeah, he just will go on talking in these accents, saying nothing of importance, and so I would sometimes just skim what he had to say. And also in the book, Richie has a few voices that are pretty racist. In particular, the voice he does that is his impression of a black slave. And I mean, it makes sense that he and the others would find this funny, given this is the 1950s, but I still did not like reading it. And also when Mike joins the group, Richie does this voice, and Mike thinks it's funny and he laughs at it as well. And so because the one black character thinks this is also funny, it's almost like King is saying that it's okay Richie does this voice because like the one black character likes it, so therefore it's not that bad. And then also adult Richie in the 80s, he still does this impression for his radio program. So even in the 80s, he is still doing this racist voice. So yeah, if you've never read the book, I guess that's just something to be aware of going into it. And in the movie, he does not talk in a variety of voices like he does in the book, but he's just kind of constantly making jokes, basically. And Bill Hader plays adult Richie, and he is great at impressions. And the movie wrote some for adult Richie to do. However, Hader felt like at this point in his career, some of those impressions had kind of been overplayed. And so he requested that he not do them in the movie. And Richie is one of the few who actually comes from a healthy childhood, like his parents. He has great parents. And we get one scene with them in the book when he's asking to go to the movies. And so he wants money. So he's asking for chores so that he can get money. And yeah, it was just such a cute interaction and I loved it. And with Richie, it's interesting though, because all 7 of these friends, or all 6 of them aside from Richie, they all have interactions with Pennywise separately before then experiencing things once they are together. But Richie is the exception because he says the first time he experienced something, he was with someone else. So first of all, with Bill, they were looking at a photo album and then it starts to move and they see Pennywise. And then later they go to the house on Neibolt Street and they see it in the form of a werewolf. And so he's like, I didn't have anything happen until I was already with friends, so I'm the exception to the rule. And yet, when he returns to Derry as an adult, he is reminded of one day as a kid before, everything all started, when he had been chased by the giant Paul Bunyan statue in town as he was trying to get away from Henry Bowers. But he had convinced himself in the moment that it was just a dream and he didn't want to think it was real. And even after other stuff with Pennywise has happened, he still is convinced it was just a dream. But as an adult, he yet again goes to the statue and it once again comes alive, and this time it confirms that that childhood experience did really happen. And so it's interesting because you have Stan, who is resistant in admitting what he experienced, and yet he still does admit he experienced it. Whereas Richie is just in total denial. And in the movie, they add that Richie is gay but closeted. And here, the first time with the Paul Bunyan statue had happened right after he had like a bonding moment with another boy. But then as soon as these boys' friends come up, that boy then turns on turns on Richie and is really mean to him. And as an adult, when Pennywise appears, it taunts him about how it's going to tell people about his secret. And I was thinking that maybe the filmmakers had this be part of Richie's character because, he doesn't want to admit that he's gay. So you could say he's in denial about it. And considering Richie was in denial about his experience with the Paul Bunyan statue, maybe they interpreted that as him being in denial about multiple things in his life. And in the end of the movie, we see that I guess he had been in love with Eddie because he had carved R+E into this bridge. And yeah, this aspect of Richie's character in the book, I was neutral. I didn't love it. I didn't hate it. I thought it was fine. But now on to Mike. So he is the only one of the 7 to stay in Derry into his adulthood, and because he stayed, he has the clearest memory of events, though he too is hazy on some of the details. But when the murders begin again, he calls them up and tells them that they need to return to Derry to fulfill their promise. And in the movie, when they realize what promise they are fulfilling, they get mad at Mike for not being straight with them when he had called. And then later in the movie, he tells them that they can defeat it by doing the ritual of Chud, but turns out he was withholding information as far as that is concerned too. So on 2 different instances, he sort of lied or misled them, which causes them to all be upset with him. And multiple times in the movie, as adults, they each are on the verge of leaving, especially Richie. But what makes Richie stay ultimately in the end is a memory of Stan, like standing up to his dad, basically. And so the courage of Stan convinces Richie to stay. But yeah, at various points, all of them are planning on leaving. And this was not the case in the book. Like once they showed up as adults, like they were committed and it didn't seem like any of them were going to leave. And I wasn't a fan of this added drama as far as them being upset at Mike at various moments and them all wanting to leave. And I assumed initially that the filmmakers maybe just thought the book was unrealistic, and it didn't make sense that once they started to remember, the filmmakers were probably like, why would they stick around? Once they remember, the logical thing is to try to leave. And so I assumed that's why they included this plot detail. However, then I watched the miniseries, and the miniseries has this as well, where they all want to leave. And so I assumed the movies actually just carried that over from the miniseries. But yeah, I preferred it in the book, where they were just all committed. But also, once they show up in Derry again, they do start getting their memories back. And also that day in Derry, they do all have experiences with it. And so they are starting to realize what they got themselves into. However, they don't remember like the full breadth of what they have committed to until they are right there about to walk into its lair. And I like this moment because Bill, in this moment, right before they see it, everything comes to him and he's like, whoa, like now I remember, and now I wish I had committed suicide because now I realize what I'm in for. And so I liked this too, that in the book, the full weight of what was happening didn't even hit them until it was too late to turn around. But yeah, to talk about Mike a bit more. So in the movie, his parents died in a fire and he is being raised by his grandpa who has a farm where they slaughter animals. Whereas in the book, he was raised by his parents and they are farmers, but they're produce farmers, so there is no slaughter going on. And he had great parents. And I love the scenes between them, especially he and his dad had more moments together. And yeah, I was kind of sad that the movie made a change to this because I enjoyed seeing the bond he had with his parents. And also in the movie as a kid, his first vision with it involves people stuck in a fire. And I thought the movie was referencing the massacre at the Black Spot, which the Black Spot was a juke joint where a lot of Black people were murdered in the past. And so I thought that's what the movie was referencing. But no, it was referencing the fact that his parents died in a fire. But yeah, like I said, in both, he is the one that stays in Derry his entire life. And unlike the others who totally forgot their time in Derry and all ended up being crazy rich and successful, Mike, he just has a normal librarian salary and a hazy memory of what had happened. And though this wasn't something he chose, he kind of became the watchman for them. And in the movie, they make it seem like he has a few screws loose, but in the book, I wasn't getting this vibe. There's a few times where he's writing the Derry interludes and he's, had a few drinks. But yeah, I never got the impression that he was crazy by any means. And in both book and movie, he is attacked by Henry Bowers, but in the book, the attack seriously injures him, and this leads him to be in the hospital. And while he does not die, he is not part of the final showdown because he's in the hospital. And I thought I was very disappointed with this in the book. Like, they all should have been part of the final showdown. And the movie does fix this because while Henry Bowers does attack him, Richie shows up right in time and kills Henry Bowers. And so Mike is part of the showdown. So I like that they fixed that. And now to talk about Ben. So Ben does not have any friends in book or movie, but in the book it says how he doesn't know what he's missing out on, and so he doesn't feel lonely because this is just normal for him. And in the movie, we get a great scene when he has a run-in with Beverly and she offers to sign his yearbook and he gives it to her and she sees that literally no one has signed it. And this was just such an effective way to quickly let the audience know that this kid has no friends. But Ben ends up hanging out with Bill and the others when he is running away from Henry Bowers. And in the movie, they go to a pharmacy to help patch Ben up when they then see Beverly there. And this is how she then also joins the group. Whereas in the book, Beverly joined the group a little later, and it's when Richie and Ben are going to go to the movies, and Richie sees Beverly just hanging out in town, and so he invites her to the movies. And so this is the event that makes Beverly part of the group. And in the movie, they have Ben be new in town, which, by the way, in the book, I didn't remember Ben being the new kid, but then in the miniseries, he is also the new kid. So I'm like, am I just misremembering the book? Like, I did not remember that detail, but maybe I just missed it. Anyway, in the movie, because he is new in town, he becomes obsessed with Derry's violent history, and he tells the others all that he has learned. And this was not the case in the book. He wasn't obsessed with Derry's history. In fact, Mike's dad is the one who was not from Derry, and so he became obsessed with learning about Derry's history. And then, of course, once Mike is an adult, he is also obsessed with learning about Derry's history for a variety of reasons. And in the movie, I understand why they had this, where we have Ben telling us these things. Because in the book, the way we find out is through these Derry interlude sections, which are written from Mike's perspective. But, the movie couldn't convey it in that same way. And so I get why they made this change to have one of the kids be super obsessed with it. But my question is, why didn't they have Mike be the one who was super obsessed with Derry history, right? Since in the book, it's his dad, and he's the one writing the Derry interludes. So I wasn't sure why they switched it to Ben. It's kind of a minor complaint, and yet at the same time, yeah, I feel like Mike would have been the one that made more sense to be the one telling them about the history. And when Ben is a kid, he is very self-conscious about being overweight, but as an adult, he eventually has lost all of the weight, and so when he shows up, everyone is surprised when they see him and how different he looks. And also in the book, Ben grows up to be a famous architect, and we had seen that he just had this innate skill with building things even as a kid. And I did like these parts in the book, right? Like how when he first meets Bill and Eddie, they are trying to make a dam and he helps them build a better one, and then the underground clubhouse. And so I liked how this new friend group encourages him with this skill he has, but this wasn't in the movie at all. I mean, in the second movie, we kind of see that he does the clubhouse, but we saw more of this in the book. But in both book and movie, Ben has a crush on Beverly, and at the very start of summer, he sends her a postcard with a poem which reads, "Your hair like winter fire, January embers, my heart burns there too." And Beverly gets the card in the movie, and she at first thinks Bill sent it to her, and she has a crush on Bill, so she is also kind of hoping that Bill sent it to her. And it isn't until the end of the movie that she then realizes it was from Ben. But the scene when she realizes this is something I will be talking about a little later. But then in the second movie, when they are adults, again, they don't have a clear memory of the past. And so once again, she remembers the poem, but she's like, yeah, like, I think Bill was the one who sent this to me. And again, it isn't until the showdown in its lair when again it clicks and she realizes that it was actually from Ben. And in the end of the movie, we see that after everything has happened, she and Ben are now together. But in the book, when she's a kid, she gets the poem, and like right away, once she gets to know Ben, she's like, oh, he's the one who sent this to me. So even though she has a crush on Bill, she knows that it was Ben. And near the end of the book, they are trying to hide away from Henry Bowers, so it's just the two of them in the clubhouse. And this is when she like asks him about the poem, and he admits he sent it, and they have a sweet moment. But then as adults, her memory, again, she doesn't remember things clearly. And so in the book, as an adult, she thinks it was Bill who sent her the poem, and it isn't until her memory returns more fully that she recalls the truth about Ben, and in the end of the book, she and Ben get together. And Beverly is the only girl in the friend group, and her gender is brought up quite a bit. And she just wants to be one of the guys, basically. And she usually is treated as such. But at one point in the book, they want to make a smoke hut. And Bill tells her, like, hey, one of us needs to stand guard, and you should do it, Beverly. And she pushes him about, like, why me? And he admits, like, it's because you're a girl, so you probably, this is too dangerous, so you probably shouldn't do it. And this is the first time that they have called out her gender in a way that makes her feel less than. And so she pushes against this and is like, oh, heck no, I'm going to go be part of that smoke hut. And so ultimately, all of them are a part of this. And then her first experience with it is when she hears voices from the drain in her bathroom, and then a bunch of blood comes out. And in the movie, the room is literally drenched, but in the book, it's just, splashes in certain areas. But in both, her father walks in, and yet he does not see anything because adults generally don't see it or see what it has done. It's, usually targeted towards kids because they're more willing to believe. Also, her dad is kind of evil, so maybe that too. He doesn't see it because he's too evil to see the truth of it, perhaps. And in the book, we are often hearing about Beverly, she's reaching that age where her body is beginning to change, and this is causing her to feel very uneasy around her father. And then her maturing body and her sexuality is something that comes up later on with her friends, which I will get into in the book. But yeah, I think because of her impending maturity, I think that's why she sees the blood, is because it represents her period. Because when a girl gets her period, it's kind of the mark of her reaching a new level in her maturity. And in the movie, people spread rumors about Beverly in school about how she sleeps around, but she tells Bill that they're all just lies. And in the book, she was only 11, but they aged the kids up here in the movie. And so yeah, in the book, this was not a rumor because they were still just kids. But in both book and movie, she has an abusive father, and in the movie, it seems heavily implied that he sexually abuses her. Whereas in the book, her father is physically abusive, and then right at the very end, it has told her father, like, oh, your daughter is hanging out with a bunch of boys, and it makes him think that they're doing sexual things together. And so in the very end, she has a confrontation with her dad where he's accusing her of doing things with boys. And so he makes sexual threats against her. And so then she is like running away from him. And as she's running away from him, later on, Henry Bowers shows up, and then she is running away from Henry. And then ultimately running away from Henry is what kind of leads them all down to go into the sewers. But in the movie, again, she has like a confrontation with her father near the end, and he is chasing her in the house when she then hits him with a toilet lid and knocks him out. And after this, Pennywise shows up and he takes her into the sewers, and her being taken to the sewers is what then gets the other 6 to go in after and save her. And in the movie, it shows her the deadlights, which puts her into a trance, and she is awakened from this by true love's kiss, which was very Disney of them, because Ben is the one who kisses her, and then after she reawakens, they recite the poem to each other, and this is when she realizes that it was from Ben. But because of being in the deadlights, adult Beverly says that she had a vision while she was in a trance, and she saw all of them as adults, and she saw how like each of them was going to die, or like a potential death, really. And this was so unnecessary in the movie, and her having these visions literally does not come into play in any way whatsoever, and so it seemed completely pointless, and I was not a fan of this added detail. But in both book and movie, Beverly, as an adult, before she then returns to Derry, so as an adult, when she has forgotten her past, she ends up marrying a man who abuses her just like her father had abused her. And so she and Eddie in particular, they end up with someone who represents a bad part of their past that they weren't able to let go. And like I said, it's a bad part of their past, and yet it is something that's familiar to them. And because they haven't fully processed it, they still are attracted to that because they aren't fully healed from their traumas. And before continuing with Stan and the rest of the story, I want to take a break and talk about childhood trauma, since we're on the topic of Beverly and she is a big part of this theme. So first of all, when they all return to Derry, a lot of them start to revert back to some of their old ways. For example, Bill, he had not stuttered in like 2 decades. And yet once he is back in Derry, he begins to stutter again. And then Richie wore glasses as a kid, but as an adult, he has been wearing contacts. But then his eyes hurt and he has to start wearing glasses again. And then you have Eddie. He had always been using an inhaler, but as a kid in the final showdown, he had broken his arm, right, prior because of Henry Bowers. And then here, Henry Bowers once again breaks his arm. And so they are all reverting to how things were when they were a kid. And I saw this as representing how when you are faced with the trauma you endured as a child, but you have not healed from it, you revert back to those old ways and those old defense mechanisms. And this reminded me of the book Big Little Lies, because there's a part where a character was raised by a dad who abused her mom. And as an adult, her parents are still together and she goes to visit them. And the dad like hits the mom or something, and the daughter then runs to hide under the bed because that is what she did when she was a kid. And so as an adult, she's hiding under the bed when she's just like, wait, like, what am I doing? Like, I'm not a kid anymore. And yet her instinct told her to do what she had done as a child. And so the Losers Club, they each have their own individual traumas from their their family life. But then they, of course, also have the trauma that they experienced from it. And in the book, we read of this. And one of the things I've spent time writing and thinking about is the nature of it. It changes, we know that. I think it also manipulates and leaves its mark on people just by the nature of what it is. The way you can smell a skunk on you even after a long bath if it let its bag of scent too near you. And yeah, as far as their individual trauma, I feel like Beverly had it the worst in many ways because of her dad. Mike, he also has different racial trauma going on from, the Bowers family harasses and is violent towards Mike's father as well as Mike. And so he has that kind of trauma going on. But all of them, aside from Mike, who does have some memories of the past, all of them had forgotten the events in their childhoods that happened from this summer. And yet, as they go into adulthood, each of them are making choices based on what they experienced, even though they don't even remember it. And so it's an example of how when you don't deal with your trauma, you might not consciously be thinking about it, and yet your subconscious, this trauma is guiding the choices you make in negative ways, and you don't even realize it. And so this book is about facing childhood traumas and allowing yourself to process them fully so that you can move on with your life in a healthy way. But then to go back to the love triangle aspect. So Ben has a crush on Bev has a crush on Bill, and Bill has a crush on Bev. So in the movie, he definitely has like a big crush on her when they're kids. In the book, he doesn't start having a crush on her until maybe partway through, but he does end up having a crush on her, though it's not as intense as Ben's crush. But as adults in the movie, Bev and Bill kiss when she still thinks he had been the one to write her the poem, but this kiss basically seems to confirm to her that there is nothing there between them. Whereas in the book, after spending the day in Derry and reconnecting all of them, Bev and Bill then end up having sex. They'd been like stirring up all of these childhood memories, and the memory of her crush comes back, and she thinks he's the one that sent her the poem. And so after all of this, they go back to the hotel, and, just one thing leads to another. However, ultimately, when all is said and done, by the end, Bill gets back with his wife, Audra, and Beverly gets with Ben. And I have more to share about this aspect of the book, but it relates more specifically to the 90s miniseries, so I'm going to save my thoughts on this for that follow-up video. So check that one out when it comes out on Friday. But then we have Stan, who I need to talk about. So when he gets the call from Mike, his memories seem to come back to him more fully than it had to the others because he can't bear to face it again, so he instead commits suicide. By the way, I loved how the book begins because we first hear about Georgie, and then from there, we hear Mike calling up people because it has started again, and we first hear about Stan, and we get his whole backstory, and then we hear about him committing suicide, and then we hear about him making the calls to the others. We also hear about the murder of Adrian. But yeah, all of this is just building so much suspense, and it's making you so invested and so curious to see where it's all gonna lead. And you get brief glimpses into it, but for the most part, it's still very mysterious. And so you're like, oh, like what's going on? Like, what is this thing? And what's their past? What's this promise? What happened? And so it was just a fantastic beginning. And by the way, there are 7 main characters, 6 of which are boys, and yet they are all so distinct, and I never once got any of them mixed up or confused. And also, I know I'm breaking off from focusing on Stan, but I also wanted to highlight how great King is at writing these childhood friendships. Like when Ben first interacts with Eddie and Bill, it was just so sweet and so believable, and it felt so real and so natural. And then when Mike first shows up to hang out with them in the book too, like you just feel the bond they have and the love they have for each other. And they were just so sweet. And I loved these extended moments where the plot isn't necessarily moving forward. It's just us hanging out with them. But I just loved hanging out with them, just being kids. And it was just so sweet and so well written. And also in the book, once Mike joins the group, each of them feels a click of sorts. Like they know the group is completed and they know that they are destined for something. And there is a part where there is another boy who is hanging out with them, but they say how like they can feel like that he's an outsider ultimately. Like it's fine to be with him, but they can tell like he's not part of the bigger picture, you know? And I didn't think the movie really did a great job conveying this, honestly. And at one point, they even have an argument that causes them to have a falling out and not hang out all 7 together anymore. And I was not a fan of this change either, because in the book, again, their bond was so deep and it was greater than themselves, and they all felt that. And so having an argument, like, it would not have caused them to have a falling out. Like, no, like, over time, they stop hanging out, but also they move and they start to forget. But yeah, so the fact that in the movie they have this rift in the friend group, I didn't like it. But then it's interesting because in the book, after the first confrontation, when they think it's died, but they're not quite sure, Stan is the one that breaks a Coke bottle and has them all promise, like, if it returns, promise you will come back to Derry. And in the movie, they have Bill be the one who does this. But yeah, in the book, it was Stan. And yet, Stan is the one who can't bear to return and chooses to kill himself instead. But again, I think it's because he had a fuller memory of what they were getting into. And like I said, in the book, when Bill starts to fully remember when they're in its lair, he's just like, oh wow, like, I wish I had committed suicide because now I realize what we're in for. But then along with him perhaps remembering things better, it's interesting too, because in the book, you know right off the bat that Stan is going to kill himself. And so all of the stories from their childhood you read knowing what Stan will do. And so you do get different hints that he doesn't have it in him, I guess, to face this a second time, which, you know, who could blame him, because it's insane in this fictional world what they had to go through. But we hear Stan thinking how, like, he's offended by what Pennywise does because it doesn't make logical sense and it shouldn't be happening, and he finds offense in it. And then there's also a part when they're in the sewers where he's like, I don't mind being scared, I just hate being dirty, because obviously the sewers are gross. And so different things about his personality that kind of clue us in as to why he makes this decision once he's an adult. And the movie tries to show this to different instances with Stan. But in the movie, it's interesting because obviously if you have not read the book, you don't know what he's going to end up doing, because the first movie is just them as kids. Oh, but then something else with the movie that was changed. So again, Stan commits suicide, but in the end, we find out he had written a letter to each of the losers explaining why he did this. And I also found this unnecessary. I guess they wanted to give him justice of some sort, but I preferred the book where he is so filled with fear, like he's not taking time to write 7 letters or 6 letters. Like, he's just killing himself and being done with it. And also in the movie, we see that as a kid, you know, he has this whole thing with his bat mitzvah, and he gives this speech about how he will always just be a loser, essentially. And we also hear how his father is a rabbi and puts a lot of pressure on him. And in the book, he was Jewish, but his father wasn't a rabbi, and we didn't get all this stuff. But before I get into the showdown they have with it, I first want to talk about why it targets children, but also why children are more powerful against it than adults. So first of all, near the end of the book, we get some sections from its perspective, and we read, "It had always fed well on children. Many adults could be used without knowing they had been used, and it had even fed on a few of the older ones over the years. Adults had their own terrors, and their glands could be tapped open so that all the chemicals of fear flooded the body and salted the meat. But their fears were mostly too complex. The fears of children were simpler and usually more powerful. The fears of children could often be summoned in a single face, and if the bait were needed, why, what child did not love a clown? As each year passed, their dreams, meaning the loser club, their dreams would grow smaller, and when it woke, it would call them back. Yes, back, because fear was fertile. Its child was rage, and rage cried for revenge. It would call them and then kill them. Only now that they were coming, the fear had returned. They had grown up, and their imaginations had weakened, but not as much as it had believed. It had felt ominous, upsetting growth in their power when they had joined together, and it had wondered for the first time if it perhaps had made a mistake." And so yeah, it feeds on children because children are easier to scare. And yet, children are also more powerful against it for the same reason, because they have such a big imagination. And in the book and movie, we hear how it takes the shape of whatever you fear the most. And so that's why they always see it present itself as something different. But then also as children, they are also so much more resilient because the things they see, like as an adult, either they wouldn't accept it, or if they did, it would just drive them insane, right? And yet a kid can see it and realize what they're seeing, and yet they can still continue on with their life, because kids are just more willing to believe something crazy, and that is also why they can hurt it. When Richie sees it as a werewolf in Neibolt Street, he has sneezing powder, and he believes this sneezing powder will work, and so he uses it against the werewolf, and it does work, and the werewolf has a sneezing fit, which helps them get away from it. Whereas adults are too logical and won't believe that something could work, and so it therefore doesn't. And so kids have imagination and a willingness to believe. And then later, Eddie, he thinks of how his inhaler tastes like acid when he has been using it a lot. And so with this thought of acid, he sprays it and it is acid. So what they imagine can come to be. And they also believe that silver will hurt it. And so they make silver slugs. And Bev does hit it with one and it does injure it. In the movie, by the way, Bev saves them when they're in the house on Neibolt Street by putting a spike through its eye. But yeah, in the book, they were all inside in this moment. And she shoots it with a silver slug and that's how they get away. And the movie kind of touches on this aspect of like, if you believe it, it'll work, because that same like stake thing that she has used as kids, when she's with Eddie, she gives it to him and she's like, here, take this, it kills monsters. And he's like, it does? And she's like, it does if you believe it. And then later in its lair, he's looking at the stake and he does believe it'll work. And so it does do significant damage. But then we read in the book, Bill nodded thoughtfully. It was like some comic book villain. Because they saw it that way, thought of it that way. Yes, perhaps so. It was kids' stuff, but it seemed that that was what this thing thrived on. Kids' stuff. And we also read of adult Ben in the book. He seemed to feel a phantom stomach swaying in front of him, and he welcomed the sensation. Got to become a child again, he thought incoherently. That's the only way I can keep it from driving me crazy. Got to become a kid again. Got to accept it, somehow. And that honestly kind of comes back to the theme of facing your childhood trauma, because in order to defeat your past, you need to put yourself mentally and emotionally back there as you were and be true to your inner child. And that is how you overcome your past pain. So it makes sense that they are all needing to mentally and emotionally revert back to how they were as kids. But yeah, I mentioned the smoke hut earlier from the book. So in the book, they all build this smoke hut with the intent of having a vision. And ultimately, Richie and Mike are the only two who can stick it out. And they do end up having a vision, and they are transported to millions of years ago when it first landed. It basically like crashed in through space, landed in what would become Derry. And so it has been living there, going through its cycle for millions of years. But in the movie, adult Mike says that he went and did a smoke ritual with a local tribe, and that is when he saw it landing on Earth. And in the movie, Richie wasn't part of this vision. And then I just want to share a quote from the book about when it, crash landed and everything. So we read, "It had come here long after the turtle withdrew into its shell, here to Earth, and it had discovered a depth of imagination here that was almost new, almost a concern. This quality of imagination made the food very rich. Its teeth rent flesh gone stiff with exotic terrors and voluptuous fears. They dreamed of night beasts and moving muds. Against their will, they contemplated endless gulfs. Upon this rich food, it existed in a simple cycle of waking to eat and sleeping to dream. It had created a place of its own image, and it looked upon this place with favor from the deadlights, which were its eyes. Derry was its killing pen, the people of Derry its sheep. Things had gone on. Then, these children." And then, so the deadlights are its true form, but then it will take the form of whatever it needs to in order to get what it wants. And then on Earth, so the deadlights are its true form, but then on Earth, its true form ends up being like this giant morphed looking spider thing, hence, this. But we read that in the book, even that spider isn't really what it is. And we read, "No," Bill thought coldly, "not a spider either, not really. But this shape isn't one it picked out of our minds. It's just the one closest our minds can come to, the deadlights, whatever it really is." And so I like sci-fi stuff like this, where some alien creature, we can't even comprehend the way it truly looks. So our brain just latches on to whatever comes the closest. And so even though they see it as a spider, like that isn't really what it is. And then also as adults, they see that the spider is pregnant and it starts laying eggs. And so when they need to defeat it, they also need to step on all of these eggs. And stepping on the eggs was definitely reminding me of Dreamcatcher. So I think he took part of that from it and brought it into that book. But its goal ultimately is to catch them in a trance. And then once they are in this trance, locked in with the deadlights, they are then like mentally in the macroverse. And while in the macroverse, he can toss them fully into the deadlights where they will stay forever. And Richie, as an adult, he enters the macroverse, and we read, and between them shone a great blind light. It glared and moved, smiled and snarled. The light was alive. Dead lights. More than alive, it was full of a force, magnetism, gravity, perhaps something else. Richie felt himself lifted and dropped, swirled and pulled, as if he were shooting a fast throat of rapids in an intertube. He could feel the light moving eagerly over his face, and the light was thinking, this was it, the rest of it. And so again, its true form, it are the dead lights, which exist in the macroverse, but on Earth, it can show them part of the dead lights, and that's what gets them like locked in this staring contest of sorts. And then yeah, once it gets locked in, its goal is to fully cast them into the deadlights. And in the movie, the deadlights are something that shows up when they face it underground and it opens its mouth, and the deadlights come from somewhere else to shine in through its face, and whoever is looking at them like they're put in a trance. And this was a cool scene in the movie when he has adult Richie in the deadlights and we see its brain open up. Like, it was pretty gross, but pretty cool. And this whole aspect of the book was pretty abstract. And so I thought this scene here, I thought the movie did a great job of portraying something that, again, was so abstract in the book. And also in the movie, when they go to its lair, the kids, some of which are dead, but some of which are still alive, such as Bev, they are literally floating because when you are in a trance from the deadlights, you float. And this makes sense because its catchphrase is, we all float down here. And yet, in the book, no one actually floats. It was just a phrase it would say. And so I didn't love that the movie felt the need to make this more literal and be like, well, why does it say that? Like, we need to have them actually float. Otherwise, why is that its catchphrase? But yeah, I liked in the book that that's just what it said, even if it didn't make literal sense. But to now move on to the ritual of Chud. So in the book, when Bill is a kid, he is researching about different entities and what he thinks it is. And he ends up reading about the ritual of Chud, which is how you can get rid of it. And it's where you're like locked in with this thing and you're in a staring contest in your physical form, but then your mental emotional selves are in this other universe where you then have like a battle of wits and a battle of inner strength, essentially. And then whoever overpowers each other in the macroverse can then injure the physical self. That's not how he reads it when he researches it. They're more confused because it's like, oh, you gotta lock tongues with it. And they think it's literal. So they're like, what? Like, you lock tongues and tell jokes? But then we find out, again, like I just explained, that it's more metaphysical, you could say. And as kids, Bill is the only one who enters this macroverse, and this is where he meets the turtle who created the universe when it was sick one day and threw the universe up. And Bill tries to get help from the turtle, like get help to defeat it. However, the turtle, like it wants them to succeed, and yet it doesn't really have much advice to offer. And what it says to them is, once you get into the cosmological shit like this, you gotta throw away the instruction manual. But Bill is able to overpower it in this moment as a kid, and we read, Chud, this Chud. Stand, be brave, be true, stand for your brother, your friends. Believe in all the things you believed in. Believe that if you tell the policeman you're lost, that he'll see you get home safely. That there is a tooth fairy who lives in the huge enamel castle. And Santa Claus below the North Pole making toys with his trove of elves. And that Captain Midnight could be real. Yes, he could be, in spite of what Calvin and Sissy Clark's big brother Carlton saying that was all a lot of baby stuff. Believe that your mother and your father will love you again. That courage is possible and words will come smoothly every time. No more losers, no more cowering in a hole in the ground and calling it a clubhouse. No more crying in Georgie's room because you couldn't save him and didn't know. Believe in yourself, believe in the heat of that desire. He suddenly began to laugh in the darkness, not in hysteria, but in utter delighted amazement. Oh shit, I believe in all those things, he shouted. And it was true. Even at 11, he had observed that things turned out right a ridiculous amount of the time. And so in this moment, while they don't kill it, he is able to overpower it enough and injure it enough, so much so that they think it did die. But yeah, he's able to overpower it by his imagination and his belief in the goodness of humanity and the goodness of the world and believing that things work out. And yeah, I just thought this was such a beautiful section. And also, again, going back to, how it is with his home life, that part too, where he says, believe that your mother and father will love you again. Like, oh man. So heartbreaking and so beautiful. But yeah, ultimately, despite Bill in this moment as a kid hurting it, it does return, of course, when they're in their late 30s. And at this point, Bill once again enters the macroverse. However, he finds out that the turtle had died some years ago, and the turtle represented something older and greater and stronger than it. And so the fact that he realizes the turtle has died, it takes a blow to him. And so he is losing in this battle in the macroverse. And Richie in the physical world can see that Bill isn't doing well. And so he then gets locked in and he is thrown into the macroverse as well. And so Richie is able to symbolically tie tongues with it. And so he is battling it and he's doing pretty good. And he has a hold on Bill to try to bring him back. However, they're still struggling a little bit. And Eddie in the physical world, he then is like, why are we just standing here doing nothing? And so then he attacks it in its physical form. And so this helps Bill and Richie able to return safely. However, it then kills Eddie. And then from here, because it as a spider is severely injured, but it still is trying to get away. And so from here, Bill and Richie go chase it, and Bill ends up, it's injured, and so it's not doing well. And Bill is able to grab the heart out of it. And then once he crushes the heart, it officially dies. And Ben, meanwhile, is the one who stomps on all the eggs to make sure its children don't take over its place. And in the book, along with the turtle representing a greater, more positive force, there is another force that is talked about as well that's even older than the turtle or it. And it does not want to believe in the existence of this other force. However, near the end, it starts to realize, wait, is there someone else out here? I thought it was just me and the turtle. But we find out that there is another greater force that is helping Bill and the losers. And so this greater force is the one that has been there at different moments, helping them along. And after he officially kills it, the existence of this other force is confirmed, and it tells Bill, son, you did real good. Whereas in the movie, the ritual of Chud is something Mike learns about from Native Americans, and he drugs Bill without consent. He says it's a microdose, but still, I was kind of shocked that he did that without telling Bill. Anyway, he gives Bill a microdose. That way Bill can have the same vision Mike had, because he's like, I need you to believe in this ritual of Chud, because if you tell the others that this will work, they will all be on board because, Big Bill, you're the leader, and I need to make sure you're on my side with this. And so he tells them that they have to go to a place that was significant to them in Derry and bring back an item, a token. Then they go into its lair, drop their tokens into this container thing that's used for the ritual, and then the deadlights will show up and they then try to overpower the deadlights. But it turns out this doesn't work. And when Pennywise shows up, it tells them that Mike lied. And the truth about this ritual is that when the Native Americans had done it, it had shown up and killed all of them. And so the ritual didn't even work. But Mike defends himself being like, I thought that if I made you guys think it would work, I thought it would work if we had faith in it. And based on the book logic, that does make sense. But in the movie, it doesn't work. But yeah, so then Pennywise turns into this giant, huge spider thing, and it gets Richie in the deadlights. But then Eddie, as in the book, he hurts it while it has Richie. However, this then causes it to kill Eddie. And from here, they are then going to try to make it physically smaller so that they can defeat it. But they realize their plan to make it smaller won't work. So then they're like, wait, there's another way to make something feel small, and that is to belittle it. And so then they start saying how we're not scared of you, you're just a dumb clown, you're stupid and you're not scary. And so as they bully it, it gets smaller and smaller. And as it shrivels, Mike takes out its heart, and then all of them together kill it by squeezing the heart. And I did love that this was a group effort in the movie, because in the book, every now and then, it kind of felt like the Bill show. Bill's in the macroverse, Bill takes out its heart, and different things. It felt like it was always Bill. And so I like that in the movie. It was kind of more even in some ways. And again, not to get ahead of myself, but this, the group effort of smashing the heart is something that they got from the miniseries. But yeah, no turtle or macroverse in the movie, unfortunately. It's not, a big surprise, but both of the two movies do make subtle references to turtles, which readers of the book will notice. And then in the book, so in both book and movie, as kids, once they leave Derry, they forget what has happened. But then in the movie, in the second movie, even when they leave Derry as adults, they still remembered that they killed it. And Bill is talking to Mike and he's like, hey, why do you think we still remember? And Mike theorizes that because it is truly dead, that is why they now have their memories intact. But I was not a fan of this. How many things have I said that about the movie where I was not a fan? But I get that they might think it's a more positive part to the story, because the fact that in the book they forget the full breadth of their friendship and this bond and what they achieved together, the fact that they forget that is kind of sad. However, I prefer the book, which has all of them, even Mike, forgetting what had happened. And Mike had been keeping a detailed diary of everything, and yet even the pages, even the words on the page begin to fade. And so literally all of them, even Mike, who was still in Derry, they all start to forget. And by the end, they have faced not only it, but also their individual childhood traumas that had previously been unresolved and had been subconsciously guiding their lives. Which, by the way, it kind of, it represents each of their individual traumas as well. But yeah, so now it is all done with, and instead the positive memories are what will be in their subconscious, positively impacting them. And honestly, remembering what they did and saw would be pretty scarring. So I think it's for their own mental health that they forget. And I think that was a mercy, like a kindness done to them by whatever the greater force is that was looking out for them. I feel like it was a kindness that greater force helped them forget the gory, traumatic details of facing it. And again, even though it's sad they forget about their friendship, the book has some beautiful quotes about how the memories will still be with them in their subconscious. And so I want to read a few. This first one comes from Mike, but then the other two come from Bill, who is still in Derry in the end, but he's getting ready to leave. My heart's with you, Bill. No matter how it turns out, my heart is with all of them. And I think that even if we forget each other, we'll remember in our dreams. You don't have to look back to see those children. Part of your mind will see them forever, live with them forever, love with them forever. They are not necessarily the best part of you, but they were once the repository of all you could become. Children, I love you. I love you so much. So drive away quick, drive away while the last of the light slips away, drive away from Derry, from memory, but not from desire. That stays. The bright cameo of all we were and all we believed as children, all that shone in our eyes even when we were lost and the wind blew in the night. Go toward all of the life there is, with all the courage you can find and all the belief you can muster. Be true, be brave, stand. All the rest is darkness. And then another part. But perhaps it is not such a good idea to look back. All the stories say so. Look what happened to Lot's wife. Best not to look back. Best to believe that there will be a happily ever after all the way around. And so there may be. Who is to say there will not be such endings? If life teaches anything at all, it teaches that there are so many happy endings that the man who believes there is no God needs his rationality called into serious question. And then another one. He awakens from this dream, unable to remember exactly what it was, or much at all beyond the simple fact that he had dreamed about being a child again. He touches his wife's smooth back as she sleeps, her warm sleep, and dreams her own dreams. He thinks that it is good to be a child, but it is also good to be a grown-up and able to consider the mystery of childhood, its beliefs and desires. I will write about all of this one day, he thinks, and knows it's just a dawn thought, an after-dreaming thought. But it's nice to think so for a while in the morning's clean silence, to think that childhood has its own sweet secrets and confirms mortality, and that mortality defines all courage and love. And now it is time to move on to Audra, who is Bill's wife. So in the movie, we see Audra at the start. She is an actress, and she is starring in a movie that Bill is writing the script for. And he tells her that he has to leave to go to his hometown, and that's all we see of Audra. We never see her again. And so it's unfortunate they didn't do more with her character. Like, I get this movie was already really long, but I did really like her in the book, and so I was sad that she's not part of this at all. And I get this book is not about Audra, and yet I liked how King made her a bigger character to some extent. Although I did read the director of the miniseries, because again, they stay more faithful to book Audra. But he did comment on how he doesn't love that Audra goes to Derry to help Bill, and yet, as we'll get into, she just gets kidnapped and becomes the quote-unquote damsel in distress. When I read the book, I didn't have an issue with the fact that she's kidnapped, but then reading him word it that way, I thought that was kind of an interesting perspective, I guess. But yeah, anyway, basically, the 2019 movie does absolutely nothing with Audra. Whereas in the book, He is the most honest because each of them have someone they tell, like, oh, I need to leave and I need to go to my hometown. But Bill is the most honest with Audra and admitting the things from his past and how he had forgotten certain things and Georgie's death. And so he is the most honest with her because they do have, like, they truly love each other and have a good relationship. And so he leaves to go to Derry. And then Audra, the next day, she puts her own career in jeopardy by choosing to follow after him and also go to Derry. Meanwhile, in the book, Bev's husband, Tom, who is abusive, he also follows Bev to Derry. She did not tell him where she was going, but he brutally beats up her best friend in order to find out. And then Audra and Tom both coincidentally end up staying in the same hotel in Derry. And while in the hotel, Pennywise is tormenting Audra. Meanwhile, it is like taking possession over Tom. And so Audra, in fear, she leaves the hotel room, but then Tom shows up and he kidnaps her and takes it to its lair. And then from here, Tom sees the deadlights in its true form and he dies on the spot. Whereas Audra, she is like thrown into the deadlights and is in a catatonic state and it like has her up in its web. And when they find out that Audra is in its lair, I mean, the adults were going into the sewers, but they find out that it has Audra. And so that's what really motivates them, especially Bill. And so this aspect was very much like Bev in the first movie, how she is kidnapped and put into a trance. That's basically what happens with Audra in the book. But yeah, so after they defeat it, they get Audra down from its web, and again, she's in a catatonic state, and they put her in a hospital. However, she does not make any improvements. And Mike, he is still in the hospital as well. So while he's there, Bill and Audra stay in Mike's house, and Bill looks after her. And again, there is no change, no matter how many weeks pass, until Bill gets an idea. So, as an adult, he had found his old bike Silver in a pawn shop and bought it. And this scene was great in the movie because Stephen King himself plays the pawn shop owner who gives Bill a lot of crap. But in the book, it was so crazy that he found Silver. And so he's like, wow, like this must be part of the showdown. Silver will come into play. And yet it never does. And so he's like, oh, that was weird. But then when he has Audra in the end, he has an idea to dress kind of like a kid again. And then he gets on the bike with Audra and he rides fast enough to beat the devil, as they say. And this exhilarating experience where they connect with their inner child brings Audra back. And in the end, all is well. Which brings me to the theme of desire, because desire comes up a lot in key moments in the book. And so it had me thinking like about desire. And so I want to read a quote from when he's on the bike with Audra. In the end, we read, "A disquieting thought ran through his mind almost too quickly to read and was gone. But it wasn't all disquiet, was it? No, it was desire as well. The feeling he'd had when he was a kid walking alone with the skateboard under his arm. The desire to go fast, to feel the wind race past you without knowing if you were racing toward or running away from, to just go. To fly, disquiet and desire. All the difference between world and want. The difference between being an adult who counted the cost and a child who just got on it and went, for instance. All the world between, yet not that much difference at all. Bedfellows, really. Disquiet and desire. What you want and what you're scared to try for." And so talk of disquiet and desire. Disquiet is what adults feel versus desire represents childhood. And then, yeah, we hear about desire. There's so many quotes. I was going to share more, but I trimmed them down. But when Bill is a kid riding Silver, we hear about the exhilaration and the freedom and the desire he feels while riding Silver. And then when Bev leaves Tom, I actually want to read this one. So when she leaves Tom, she feels this freedom and exhilaration, and we read, "That wild exhilaration washing through her again like a tidal wave that lifted and carried and cleansed. A force so powerful that any conscious thought was lost. Only her blood thought and its one powerful voice spoke to her in some inarticulate way of desire. Although what it was it desired she neither knew nor cared. It was enough to feel that warmth, filling her up with its insistence." And then when Bill and Richie are fighting it as adults, we read, "With a scream building in him, building up and up and up, Bill charged. Richie ran with him stride for stride. They struck together with their right fists, but Bill understood it was not really their fists they were striking with at all. It was their combined force, augmented by the force of that other. It was that force of memory and desire. Above all else, it was the force of love and unforgotten childhood, like one big wheel." And then another quote I want to share. This is when Bill is a kid and he's thinking how all 7 of them, all of their families stayed in Derry that summer, which is unusual because a lot of families either go on summer vacation Or a lot of families left Derry because they could sense that something bad was happening. But then we read, grown-ups, a word absolutely synonymous in Bill's mind with mothers and fathers, had decided then as now that away was better, safer. Anyone able to clear out had cleared. Bill understood away, and he could muse over a word of such fabulous wonder as gestad, but wonder was cold comfort compared with desire. Gestad was away, Derry was desire. And so desire can have sexual connotations, which we will get to in a minute, but it can also represent freedom, right? Like the freedom Bill feels when he is riding Silver, the freedom Bev feels when she leaves Tom. And the opposite of desire is to feel apathy or distaste. And you could say, or, disquiet is, talked about as well. And so you could say that Bev, throughout her adulthood, she has not felt that feeling of desire. And it's not until she leaves Tom and is heading back to Derry that childhood feeling of desire comes back. And yeah, desire in general, like it's so exhilarating and exciting and all-encompassing. And I recently covered Requiem for a Dream, and despite the order of when my videos were released, I read it before reading Requiem for a Dream. And so because desire was on my mind while reading Requiem, I was thinking about that a lot in that book, and how, we all want something to desire, because feeling desire, it gives you something to look forward to. It gives you a reason to wake up in the morning, and it's a reason to keep going, and something that makes you feel alive. And so this feeling of desire is key when defeating it. And Pennywise also is filled with desire, although it's probably more of a hunger is probably the better way to describe it. But still, the human children feeling desire going up against Pennywise and its own version of desire and hunger, and the human desire overpowers Pennywise's desire/hunger. But desire is also mentioned quite a few times in the most infamous scene in this book. So Bev is reaching puberty around age 11, like I've talked about, and her father starts to sexualize her in the end. But also, the boys in the friend group, all of them will have different emotions stir in them, having Beverly around. And there's also a scene in the book where her shirt pops open, and so she's having to, as a kid, she's having to cover herself, and the boys are seeing the glimpse of a side boob. And so yeah, she wants to be seen as just a kid who just wants to have fun, and yet because of her changing body, grown-ups and these boys are seeing her more as a, quote-unquote young woman than as just another kid. And then in the sewers, after they have gotten rid of it for the first time, they are getting lost and trying to find their way out, but they seem to be losing touch with each other and losing their way, when Bev knows what she can do to bring them all together and get them all on track again. And so she starts to undress and tells them that each of them need to have sex with her. Mind you, they are all 11 years old, and not only do we get descriptions of them having sex, in particular, we get a very detailed description of when she is with Ben and Bill, because she orgasms when she is with Ben and Bill. And so not only did Stephen King write about 11-year-olds having sex, he writes about it in kind of a detailed way. Also, this scene could have been cut and nothing would have been changed. They had already defeated it as kids. And this was done just because they started getting lost in the sewers. This whole part could have been cut out of the book and the story would not have suffered. And I get Bev being sexualized and her impending period as part of her character. So I can see how someone can make sense of this scene, and how her making the choice to do this is her taking the power of her gender and her maturity, impending maturity, and using it for good. And so reclaiming her gender kind of a thing, right? And instead of seeing it as a negative thing, because throughout this book, she has been looked down on because she's a girl. And yet in this moment, she's able to be like, you know what? Yeah, I'm a girl, but that's what gives me my power. And so I can see how you could justify it in that way. And I feel like that would work fine if they were even just a little bit older. Even if they were 15, maybe it would be different, but they're literally 11 years old. It's so gross. But having sex with each other, it also is something that they are able to give and take power from each other and give and take strength. And this does come up at other times too, when Mike is in the hospital, down in the sewers, they can tell something bad is going to happen to him. So they hold hands and they send Mike some of their power. But yeah, some of the quotes about this in the book we read from when they're having sex. His face, his dear, sweet, earnest face, and knows it is not fear. It is wanting he feels, a deep, passionate wanting now barely held in check. And she feels that sense of power again, something like flying, something like looking down from above and seeing all the birds on the roof peaks, on the TV antenna atop Wally's, seeing streets spread out map-like. Oh, desire, right, this was something. It was love and desire that taught you to fly. And later, and she feels her power suddenly shift to him. She gives it gladly and goes with it. This is flying. This, oh love, oh desire, oh this is something impossible to deny. Binding, giving, making a strong circle. Binding, giving, flying. And so yeah, later as adults, this memory of desire and what they shared with each other is part of what gives them their strength. Which again, like I get you could make sense of this scene and justify it all you want, and I can see where you're coming from, but at the end of the day, they were only 11 years old, which makes it super weird and gross and kind of perverted. Also, I understand that sex is that moment where they kind of see like losing your virginity is when it's the loss of innocence and you go from being a child into adulthood. And so again, I can see the purpose of this scene for all of those reasons. If he just wanted to include this scene, though, he shouldn't have had them be so young. But something else that is interesting about this section is how Bev is thinking about how girls at school refer to sex as it, which makes you wonder, the title, It, is it actually in reference to sex and not Pennywise? I'm kidding, kind of. But it's interesting because it also talks about how power is a shapeshifter, right? And Pennywise shapeshifts into whatever will give it the most power. But then the act of sex is also a form of power. And there's a giving and taking of power in sex. And so in some ways, the it of Pennywise and the it of sex are two different forms of power. And the power of sex, again, overtakes the power of Pennywise. But I've mentioned Henry Bowers a few times now, and I want to talk about him a bit more in depth because he is a key character. Because as the head bully, he inadvertently brings all 7 kids together because his bullying is what they have in common. And Ben and Mike join the group because they are being chased by Bowers. And as the summer goes on, he becomes more and more influenced by Pennywise and goes legitimately crazy and is willing to kill all of the Losers Club. And near the end of the childhood section, Pennywise sends him a knife and tells him what to do, beginning with telling him to kill his dad. And this is in both book and movie. And in the movie, there are 2 scenes when we see a kid's show on TV. And the first time we see it, the host is talking about like, oh, the sewers are such a fun place to explore. And then we see this show again as he is about to kill his dad. And the woman on the show is saying like, oh, you need to kill them. You need to kill them all. And then the woman morphs into Pennywise. But I loved these 2 scenes with this TV show. It was so creepy and eerie. Also the fact that it's a wholesome kids show, but then really it's being run by Pennywise. And again, like I said, in the end, he is chasing the Losers Club and they run into the sewers, which leads Henry and his buddies to run into the sewers. And the 2 friends he goes down in with, they end up being killed. However, Henry is able to escape. And as we see in the second movie, Henry is then arrested for the murder of his dad. And in the book, they also pinned all of the other murders that summer on him. And he goes to an insane asylum. And after 27 years, Pennywise returns to him and helps him break out so that he can do Pennywise's bidding. And in both, his dead friend shows up to drive him to the adult losers so he can attempt to kill them. And in the book, this was not the case in the movie. But in the book, the car the friend is driving is a 58 Plymouth Fury, which of course is the same car that Christine was. And again, in the book, he attacks Mike first, which leads Mike to go to the hospital. And then he goes to the hotel and attacks Eddie. He breaks Eddie's arm and injures Eddie, but ultimately Eddie kills Bowers. Whereas in the movie, he attacks Eddie first, and then he goes to attack Mike. But before being able to hurt Mike, Richie shows up and kills him. But then I also wanted to mention one of Bowers' friends, Patrick Hockstetter. So he is in the first movie and is played by Owen Teague, the same guy who played Harold Lauder in the new show The Stand. And he was great in The Stand, so it was cool to see that he had also been in it. But he dies very early on, so we do not see too much of him. And in the movie, all we see is that he's a bully who ends up being killed. But in the book, we learned that Patrick Hockstetter is like a straight up psychopath who murdered his baby brother when Patrick was like 5 years old. And then as he got older, he then started killing neighborhood animals. And we get so much detail about him, and he was so disturbing. And ultimately in the book, he is killed by it in a very disturbing scene, more disturbing than what we saw in the movie. But yeah, Patrick was a demented psycho. So even though he was a kid, in some ways it was like good riddance to have him die. And then I want to discuss Derry because it landed in Derry before Derry even existed as a town. And so it like permeates in the soil here. And the first people that ever settled in Derry all mysteriously disappeared. And we can assume that it killed them, but obviously people who are studying the history don't know what happened. But not only does it feed on Derry by killing and literally feeding on them, it also feeds on the evil within the townspeople. So some people like Henry Bowers and people like Tom who show up in town, they are evil and messed up people. And so it is easy for Pennywise to influence them to do its bidding. But it can also influence people not to actively do evil, but instead to just turn away and not pay attention when evil is being done. And we got this in the movie when Bowers and his gang are beating up Ben and a car drives by and the people look and see what's happening, but they just keep driving. And then we see a balloon in the back seat, which to me clearly shows that it is present and allowing them to go uninterrupted. And I also liked when Bowers and them are beating up Mike and Mike sees Pennywise in the grass. Not only was this a super creepy visual, but it also shows again that Pennywise is involved in the violence that happens in this town. And there are times in the book when adults will stop and interfere when Bowers is beating someone up, but there's also plenty of times when adults see what's happening and do nothing. And there is a part in the book when Beverly is being chased by her father in the end. He is like threatening her life in many ways, and she is screaming for help, and a neighbor sees. And then the neighbor, like they're reading outside and they see what's going on and they straight up just put the paper down and go inside. So, just the complacency to allow abuse to happen and to not care, and then also to deny that you even saw it in the first place. And we get so many stories in the Derry interlude sections about all of the different violence that has happened throughout the decades and just how it will fan the flames of evil that already exists in people. Like it doesn't put it there, but it definitely encourages it. And so, for example, I want to share the story of the Bradley gang. So this is, I forget what decade this takes place in, but there's this gang that is going to come to Derry just to pick up supplies, and people in town know about it. And so they all get their weapons and are set to ambush this gang. And so when the people show up, it is a massacre. And even when they want to surrender, like the people of Derry are just brutally killing all of them. And there is a guy that Mike is interviewing who admits that he was there because most people will deny that they were part of it. And the news wrote about it, but they were like, oh, the FBI caught the Bradley gang, acting like it wasn't a brutal massacre done by the people. But anyway, this guy actually admits like that, yeah, he was there. And he says that he saw a guy with clown face paint also shooting. And this, of course, is Pennywise because Pennywise is always part of these violent outbursts. And he says how when he saw Pennywise, he thought the clown was firing with the same gun he had. And yet another guy was like, no, like he had the same gun I had. And so on and so forth. They all see Pennywise with whatever gun they were holding. And I think this is because they were each contributing to the violence and the evil. And so when this violence is happening, the people are Pennywise and Pennywise is the people. Like they become one and the same, basically. And also the second movie begins with the murder of Adrian Mellon, which we hear about in the book. So he was a gay man who was attacked by some homophobic thugs, and then Pennywise gets involved. And this section is so haunting and horrifying. And in the book too, we get so many details about like every character that's introduced, even a minor character. And so we hear so much about Adrian and his boyfriend. And so then when they're just out enjoying, the Derry celebration days, hearing about his life and how they're just out having fun, when then they are attacked by these thugs and then Pennywise becomes involved and it just becomes this brutal, horrific murder. Like it was like, I feel like the murder of Adrian has haunted me more so than the murder of Georgie. And in the book and movie both, like I keep seeing that visual of Pennywise coming out of the water, holding Adrian and killing him. And just, it's so disturbing and so upsetting and so, yeah, I don't even know what to say, but I find the murder of Adrian just particularly horrifying. But another story that I found really upsetting to read about, and this is not in the movies, is the story of the Cochran brothers. So Eddie and Dorsey Cochran, they are both abused by their stepfather. And the father ends up killing Dorsey, which all the backstory with Dorsey was just so horrible, and the way the town of Derry turns a blind eye to this abuse. Anyway, so that son is killed, and then Eddie disappears, Eddie Cochran, not Eddie Casabrac. So he disappears and people say like, oh, he just ran away from his stepfather. But we find out that he was actually killed by Pennywise. And so that too, where it's like, man, this poor little boy whose brother is dead and he is trying to get away only to be murdered by Pennywise is just so horrible and sad. And that was another really hard story to read. But then we also hear about the murder at the Black Spot, which I mentioned, which again, that was a juke joint that the Black people would hang out at. And then the Legion of White Decency, which was the North's version of the KKK, they set it on fire, and a young Dick Halloran from The Shining, as well as Mike's dad, they were present and they were able to escape and they were able to help save others. However, so many people ended up being violently killed in this fire. And then another story I want to mention is the cutting of Claude Hurreau in 1905. So Claude Hurreau shows up in this bar and he has an axe and he just starts chopping people up. And there are people sitting at the bar who just keep drinking, acting like nothing is happening. Meanwhile, this graphic murder is taking place. And eventually, Claude, he's cutting people. And then eventually he just stops and he sits down. And then, police come and arrest him. And then people of the town then gather together and lynch Claude Hurreau that night while he is in jail. And the people who lynch him are some of the same people who had been sitting in the bar ignoring it when it happened. And so the influence of Pennywise leads people to ignore violence and let it happen. And then they get self-righteous later on and become violent themselves as if it is their right to get justice. Same with the Bradley gang too. Like they felt like it was their right to kill this gang. And then they will later claim that they weren't there and had nothing to do with it and deny it. But then in the book, Mike, he is the one who writes these interludes and he is talking about the definition of haunting or haunt. And we read, "This one, like the last, is a definition of haunt as a noun, and it's the only one that really scares me. A feeding place for animals, like the animals that beat up Adrian Mellon and then threw them over the bridge, like the animal that was waiting underneath the bridge. A feeding place for animals. What is feeding in Derry?" And by the way, in the end of the book, when they have the final showdown with it, as that is happening, there is a major storm causing so much destruction and death in Derry. But then once it dies, the storm magically clears up. Whereas in the movie, the house on Neibolt Street collapses in on itself, but that is the only destruction that takes place. And I feel like this video has been a bit more book heavy, so I just wanted to share some movie thoughts here in the end. So first of all, I think the casting in both movies was great all the way around. Bill Skarsgård is amazing as Pennywise, and if I had watched this as a teenager, this movie would truly have scarred me forever. Even without CGI, like just the way he looks, his makeup, certain scenes, it still, as an adult, it still creeps me out when I think about it. Also, at times, Pennywise, his eyes are looking in different directions, which is very unsettling. And I thought that was like from the contacts or CGI or something. But no, Skarsgård can just do that naturally with his eyes. But as far as CGI goes, I did want to say that they used some in the first movie, but I thought the second movie in particular had too much CGI, and I wish they would have toned it down a bit. And something else I really liked in the movie was how, like I said, in the book, they see photographs move, whereas in the movie, instead, they're playing like a slide projector photos. And at first, they see Pennywise show up in the photos, and then it straight up comes out of the screen, and the photo thing is going on its own. And then it comes out of the screen. And that scene was so cool. And I thought that was a really cool spin on the moving photographs, Pennywise in the photographs that we got in the book. Also, I liked that in the second movie, we get flashbacks to scenes when they were kids. And in some ways, I felt like the first movie was so plot heavy that we didn't get enough moments of just seeing the kids hanging out. Whereas the second movie was able to highlight their bond a bit more. And, we actually see their underground clubhouse. And so I did appreciate getting more of those moments because, again, their childhood bond was one of the best parts of the book. But then with the second movie, I also wanted to comment on the humor because we get some moments of humor that work and that I liked. And we do have Bill Hader, who is very funny. But the second movie almost bordered on a horror comedy, which that is not what I want from it. I want it to take itself more seriously. You know, a horror movie that's a drama can have some comedy and make it work. For example, Sinners, which in my mind is just like a perfect movie. That had a pinch of humor, like just the right amount, while still being a very serious film. So it can be done. But yeah, in It Chapter 2, there was way too much comedy. And yeah, I was not a fan. They should have toned it down a ton. Speaking of which, the Chinese restaurant scene, I liked that at first. And once Pennywise starts to infiltrate this event, it starts to feel kind of trippy and disorienting and chaotic, which I liked. But then the restaurant scene, they just went so over the top with it. Again, like bordering on comedy, which I wasn't a fan of. So it started out good and then they just went too far. But when Eddie dies, that is something that was played more seriously. So I was glad in that moment, at least, they didn't, try to make a ton of jokes about it. But also I wanted to mention that in the second movie, when they are in its lair, they each are in these different situations where they're feeling trapped and going to die. And Ben and Bev are in two different scenarios, and yet they call out to each other and start reciting the poem. And this is when Bev realizes, like, oh, Ben wrote that poem. And then them sharing this poem ends up saving both of them. And I'll be honest, the movies at times kind of did too much with this poem. Like the way it was recited so often was a bit much. But I'll be damned if I didn't get just a little bit emotional in this scene in the end when they save each other by reciting the poem. So as cheesy as that was, I actually did kind of like it. And then also I wanted to mention in the first movie, I love the scene when they go help Beverly clean up the blood in her bathroom. This was in the book as well. And yeah, both book and movie, this scene highlights the bond and friendship they have and being there for each other as Pennywise taunts them. And Pennywise taunting them and harassing them is kind of just bringing them closer and closer together. And yeah, I just love the scene when they help her clean the bathroom. Also, I like the scene as they go around Derry and each have their different experiences. Again, this was in the book. In the movie, they're going around Derry looking for tokens, whereas in the book, they were going around Derry just to jog their memories. But yeah, each of them has some sort of experience aside from Bill. But yeah, I did like these moments too. And yeah, both of these movies together were like 5 hours because the first movie is like 2 hours, 15 minutes. The second movie is like almost 3 hours. So it's basically 5 hours. And I watched them back to back the same day, and it was not a chore at all. Like, I enjoyed watching these, and I was invested with both of them. And so for the most part, despite all of my complaints, I did enjoy them both a fair amount. The second movie has a lot of negative reviews, which kind of confused me. Like, I have my issues with the second movie as well, but I didn't get all of the hate people seem to have for it. Also in the movie, they go on a lot about how Bill, who is the king stand-in, saying how he does not know how to write endings and his endings are always terrible. And he is working on an adaptation of his book. And they're telling him, like, you need to write a new ending for the movie because the ending you put in the book sucks. And so I know King gets a lot of crap about his endings in general being bad, but this felt like they were specifically talking about it as if it had a bad ending. And that's why the movie was making these changes. But as far as like the cosmic aspect, I really like that part of the book and with the turtle and everything. The only part of the ending I didn't like in the book is the scene with Bev in the sewers. But yeah, so if they were making a commentary of being like, the book, it has a horrible ending, so we're changing it. Like, yeah, it's good Stephen King has a sense of humor about this because even he, as the pawn shop owner, is giving Bill crap about having a bad ending. But yeah, anyway, I like the ending of the book, it, personally. But when it comes to book versus movie, of course, I am going to say that the book wins. It's just so expansive and thought-provoking and scary and disturbing. And the domestic abuse that Bev experiences and the racism that Mike and his family experience, honestly, those were the parts that I had the hardest time reading and that were very upsetting, partly because they're so real. And that's kind of the point of it, right? Is how Pennywise, again, it takes advantage of the evil that already exists in people that is done in real life. But again, the way he writes about the friendship between these kids was so beautiful and sweet, and the way they're there for each other. And I also loved the moments where we hear about the kids having fun and playing, using their imagination, like acting like they're out hunting and like, there's a tiger, be quiet. And just, he captured that childhood innocence and playfulness and imagination so well. And it was just so sweet and I loved it. And honestly, I kind of liked how weird it got with the macroverse aspect and how abstract and sci-fi it was, and the turtle and the other. And so for me, all of that worked and I really liked it. And I also liked how we do get a happy ending and we see the beauty in life, despite the book being so full of the ugliness within people, which again, Pennywise manipulates and takes advantage of. And yet there is also so much goodness, and the goodness is what ends up winning. And yeah, there are just so many beautiful passages in here. I shared a lot of quotes. I had even more in my original rough draft, but I had to cut some so this video wouldn't be even longer than it already is. But yeah, some really beautiful writing. And I love the book. So it definitely wins over both of the movies, although I would still recommend the films and I did enjoy them. So yeah, that wraps it up for it, although not entirely, because stay tuned for my mini-series video. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Don't forget to share your thoughts down below in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe. And thank you so much, especially if you watched this video all the way through. Like, wow. Thank you. I really appreciate you giving about an hour and a half, 2 hours of your time to watching this. It means a lot to me. So yeah, thank you so much. And I will see you on Friday to talk about the mini-series. Bye.